On August 18, 2025, before the sun climbed over Ouagadougou's skyline, silence covered the city like a blanket. Then came boots on concrete, rifles slung over shoulders, soldiers forming a line in front of the American embassy. Behind the iron gates, a flag began to fall, not just any flag, but the Stars and Stripes, once raised with pride, now packed in a box. It wasn't just protocol. It was history. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had made his move. He ordered every U.S. official out of Burkina Faso. The embassy, the power, the shadow of foreign control gone in 72 hours. Why? Because Washington dared to compare his soldiers, who defend villages with their lives, to extremists who destroy them. Traoré stood in his palace and said, "We are not your criminals." The people gathered, not in fear, but with fire. Sovereignty is not for sale, they chanted. Dignity over dependence. Honor over handouts. But can a poor nation survive without aid? Can pride fill empty stomachs? That is the question. And this is the moment. If you believe Africa must stand tall no matter the cost, type Africa Rise in the comments. And subscribe, because our story is not over. It's just beginning. August 18, 2025. Not a single gun fired that morning, but the shockwaves were louder than war. In the quiet halls of the presidential palace, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before his council with a report in his hands. It came from Washington, stamped, sealed, delivered. And inside, poison. The kind that hides behind polite language. The kind that wounds with words. It accused his army of aligning with terrorists. It dared to write, from thousands of miles away, that the soldiers of Burkina Faso, those who sleep in dirt, bleed in the bush, and stand guard over their people, were no different from the men who plant bombs in schools. Traoré flipped through the pages slowly. His eyes burned. His fists clenched. He said nothing at first. But then, in a voice carved from stone, he asked, "Did they read the UN numbers? 2,000 of our civilians dead last year alone. Over 2 million displaced since 2016. And they dare to compare us to killers." A cold silence filled the room. One minister tried to explain, "Perhaps they don't understand." "They understand," Traoré snapped, slamming his palm on the table. "They understand perfectly. They just refuse to see our pain as real." Around him, advisors sat in shame. But he didn't ask for sympathy. He asked for action. "Call the press," he said. "Let the people hear every word of this insult." That night, across Burkina Faso, the national broadcaster repeated the report aloud. Word for word. No edits. No diplomacy. "The United States alleges human rights violations by Burkinabe forces," the voice read, suggesting potential collaboration with extremist groups. In living rooms from Djibo to Ouagadougou, families sat in stunned silence. Young soldiers stared at the screen. One whispered, "So they call us criminals." Another said, "We buried brothers in Yaga, defended schools in Arbinda, and still they paint us as monsters." Anger rose like smoke from every corner of the country. And in the palace, Captain Ibrahim knew the time had come. "This is not about law," he said. "This is about story. If they write us as villains, who will remember our truth?" Then came his decision. Not a press release. Not a negotiation. A decree. Signed at dawn. Effective immediately. Captain Ibrahim's latest news broke before breakfast: the complete expulsion of the United States Embassy. Not just the ambassador. Every official. Every symbol. Every shadow of influence. 72 hours to leave. Outside the embassy, soldiers formed a wall. Boots in the Sahel dust. Rifles crossed. Behind the gates, American staff packed boxes in silence. The Stars and Stripes lowered for the last time, folding slowly into history. and on the streets of Ouagadougou, the people gathered. Not in fear, but in fire. They chanted one truth: sovereignty is not for sale. Some cried. Some prayed. All stood tall. Burkina Faso latest news spread across radios, into villages, across borders. The decision was bold. Dangerous. But necessary. One elder, leaning on a cane, said, "They fed us for decades, but always with a leash. Today, we chose hunger over chains." Inside the palace, concerns rose. Ministers spoke of schools without funding, clinics without medicine, aid programs at risk. Traoré listened. Then spoke with steel in his voice. A school built on shame teaches obedience. A hospital funded by disrespect only hides the wound. If we lose their money, so be it. But we will not lose our soul. Some called it madness. Others, martyrdom. But none could deny it was history. And that history was being written not in Washington, not in Brussels, but in Burkina Faso. In the dust. In the sweat. In the voices rising across the land. The embassy doors closed with a thud. But what opened was greater, the heart of a nation unchained. If you believe the stand for dignity echoes far beyond the Sahel, leave a comment that says Africa rise. And subscribe, because the story isn't about rebellion. It's about remembrance. And reclaiming the voice that was always ours. The day after the expulsion, the sun rose over Ouagadougou with more weight than light. In the streets, people whispered the same question: what now? At the markets, women held bags of rice tighter than usual. In the clinics, doctors counted antibiotics with growing concern. The silence wasn't panic, it was calculation. For decades, America had funded more than $100 million annually in Burkina Faso. That money paid for medicine, education, grain. Now, the tap was closing. And the people knew it. But still, there was no fear. There was only resolve. In a dusty village near the Sahel, a farmer wiped sweat from his brow and said, "We've eaten with our heads bowed for too long. I'd rather eat nothing standing up." Those words traveled like wind. From the fields to the capital. From the mouths of the poor to the ears of power. Inside the presidential palace, the atmosphere had shifted. Ministers met in emergency session. One from education stood first. "We've already lost over 6,000 classrooms due to insecurity. Without American aid, our school system could collapse." Another, from health, followed. "Our clinics are running low. Our doctors rely on foreign support to keep patients alive." Their voices weren't hostile. They were worried. Sincere. Honest. But Traoré listened in silence, letting every fear echo in the room before he stood. "Then we must ask ourselves," he said slowly, "is a school built on foreign shame truly a school? Is a clinic propped up by contempt a place of healing?" No one answered. Because the truth needed no reply. It stood on its own. Burkina Faso latest news spread beyond policy rooms and into the hearts of ordinary people. In rural towns, families gathered by radios, not for music or football, but to listen. To wonder. To ask if pride could replace aid. One journalist interviewed a veteran in the town square. The man, leaning on his cane, said, "They called us beggars for generations. But now, our captain has shown them we have no price. We didn't bury America. We buried arrogance." And across the city, murals began to appear. One, painted on a public wall, showed the American flag descending while the flag of the Sahel Alliance rose beside it. Underneath, bold letters read, "Our story. Our pen." Back in the capital, Captain Ibrahim latest news had reached every foreign embassy. France called it a reckless move. The EU warned of isolation. The United States prepared to suspend all aid. But Traoré remained firm. Let them close their checkbooks, he said in council. A nation raised on dependence will never rise. Better hunger in truth than fullness in submission. The ministers didn't all agree. But none could speak against his courage. In private, one asked, "And if the people starve?" Traoré answered without anger, "Then we will starve with honor. And they will know we chose dignity over dollars." But this wasn't just pride. It was vision. Traoré sent delegates to Mali and Niger. The Sahel alliance strengthened. Turkey promised hospitals. Russia offered equipment. China sent quiet emissaries, no sermons, just cooperation. Still, the captain was cautious. "We don't trade one master for another," he said. "Let them talk. Let them offer. But never forget dignity is not for rent." In the refugee camps, children gathered around soldiers. One boy tugged on Traoré's sleeve and asked, "Will we eat tomorrow?" The captain knelt and replied, "Maybe not much. But what we eat will be ours. And one day, you'll understand freedom feeds the soul more than bread." That moment, captured by cameras, played on national television. Not numbers. Not speeches. Just a hand on a child's shoulder and a promise carried in the wind. And still, the people stood tall. In the mosques and churches, prayers were whispered for strength. In the fields, men worked with backs straight. In the schools still open, children recited lessons about pride and purpose. No longer victims. No longer voiceless. But a nation beginning again. And you, listening now, do you believe the stand for sovereignty is worth the cost? Then type New Africa in the comments. And subscribe, because they wrote our story in silence for too long. Now it's our turn to speak. Inside the high walls of the presidential palace, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before a weathered map of the Sahel. Dust from the desert tapped the windows like ancient spirits calling for witness. The room behind him was tense, his ministers seated, their faces marked by fear, hope, and uncertainty. The latest international headlines screamed of chaos. Burkina Faso latest news, full diplomatic break with Washington. Analysts warned of catastrophe, hunger, isolation. But Traoré saw something else. "They call this madness," he said, voice steady, "but I call it awakening." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words carried the weight of centuries. In Mali and Niger, leaders sent messages of support. Across the Sahel, flags of the new alliance were hoisted red and green against blue skies. It wasn't just a regional pact. It was a declaration that Africa would no longer kneel to judgment from capitals far away. "They measure us by reports," Traoré said, lifting the American dossier again, its pages scribbled with red ink. "They call our defenders murderers. They call our struggle an atrocity. But who counts our dead? Who names our children?" In silence, his generals bowed their heads. 2,000 civilians lost in 1 year. Over 2 million displaced. But still, Western voices called them aggressors. Captain Ibrahim's latest news traveled fast. In Moscow, commentators applauded him as a new lion. In Beijing, emissaries offered infrastructure without lectures. In Ankara, Turkish aid groups expanded medical missions. The world was moving. But Traoré remained firm. "Let them come," he said, "but we must hold the pen. No more masters. No more borrowed voices." In Washington, a senator whispered in the hallway, "What if more nations follow?" The thought rattled through the corridors of power. Could Africa truly stand on its own? Could the dominoes fall? At home, the people of Burkina Faso faced difficult days. Medicine grew scarce. Food prices climbed. But dignity had a strange power. It held the country upright. In the town of Kaya, a grandmother stood outside a closed clinic and said, "They think we fear hunger. But we have known hunger. What we cannot live without is respect. Her words were repeated on village radios, in sermons, in chants. In the capital, students painted her quote across a wall, "You can feed me today, but don't steal my tomorrow." Traoré understood that this was not just a political act. It was a narrative war. "They've written our story too long," he told his staff. "They called us victims. They made us beggars. But what if we told our own?" A new mural rose in Ouagadougou, the American flag being lowered, the Sahel Alliance flag raised. Beneath, bold letters, "Our history, our voice." At its unveiling, Traoré said, "We are not ending relationships. We are ending dependency. We are not burning bridges. We are building roots." Still, doubt remained. A young advisor asked quietly in a council meeting, "Captain, what if we fail?" The room was silent. Then Traoré answered, "Then we fail standing. And we teach our children that even failure can be honorable." His words echoed beyond walls. They became songs in the streets, poems in classrooms, graffiti on alleyways. The people weren't marching against anyone. They were marching for themselves. This wasn't just Burkina Faso. This was a mirror. For every African nation told to bow. For every elder who remembered chains. For every child who deserved to grow without shame. And to you, watching this from wherever you are, maybe from Detroit, from Baltimore, from Atlanta, ask yourself, is this what Africa needed all along? If you believe it is, say amen in the comments below. Let the world know, the sleeping lion has risen. And don't forget to subscribe, because this story is not over. It's only just finding its voice. Across the Atlantic, in newsrooms and boardrooms, the question echoed louder than ever. What had Captain Ibrahim done? From Washington to Paris, from Brussels to Tokyo, headlines flashed, "Burkina Faso latest news, defiance or disaster." The tone varied, but the core remained: a nation had dared to step off the script. For years, African countries had been expected to comply, to request aid, to follow orders. But now, Traoré stood alone and not bowed. He wasn't holding out his hand. He was holding up a mirror. In France, the former colonial power, officials called it reckless. Diplomats spoke of lost influence, lost control. One minister whispered, "He is cutting the last rope." But for Traoré, that was the point. "If the rope only pulls us backwards," he said, "then let it break." Captain Ibrahim latest news wasn't just a headline. It was a rupture in the narrative of dependence. A young journalist in Accra called it a literary rebellion, Africa reclaiming the pen. And what a story it was. In Bamako, Niamey, Conakry murals bloomed overnight. Children drew Sahel flags in their notebooks. University halls buzzed with debate. One student in Dakar wrote, "We're not just watching Burkina Faso. We are watching ourselves." In Harlem, elders nodded. In Johannesburg, freedom songs were remixed with Traoré's words. Dignity is not a gift. It is a birthright. But not everyone was convinced. In Geneva, aid organizations scrambled. What would happen to the health programs, the clinics, the schools? One UN official said, "They're walking away from over $100 million a year." Who does that? Traoré had answered already, weeks before, "You cannot buy a man's soul with a meal. You can feed a body, but still starve a people's pride." His voice was calm, but his eyes burned. If Africa cannot speak without permission, then what have we really gained? Inside Burkina Faso, the pain was real. Clinics strained, prices rose, teachers feared school closures. But so too was the purpose. In a radio interview, an old farmer said, "For the first time in my life, I see a leader who speaks like my grandfather." The words reached Traoré. He wept in private, they said. Not from weakness, but from the weight of expectation. He had become more than a man. He was now a symbol. In the capital, artists painted a great mural, a quill breaking chains. Below it, the words, "Burkina writes back." It went viral. Across platforms, across languages. And the world, stunned, began to listen. Not to pity. Not to scold. But to hear. Even in the US, a young activist asked on national TV, "Why are we so afraid of a black country standing tall?" The silence that followed was more powerful than any answer. Still, the pressure mounted. Threats of sanctions. Threats of isolation. Yet Traoré remained unmoved. "They fear not our weapons," he told his ministers. "They fear our voice." At a late-night cabinet meeting, an advisor asked, "Captain, if the media turns against us, who will tell our truth?" He replied without pause, "We will. In markets, in songs, in the whisper of a grandmother. Let them write headlines. We will write history." And so they did. Not with guns, but with stories. Not with apologies, but with defiance. A new narrative was rising. One that said Africa was not a mistake to be managed, but a memory to be restored. In a small village outside Ouagadougou, a teacher stood before her class. She held up a map and said, "This is where dignity spoke." A child raised his hand and asked, "Will they listen?" She smiled gently. "Some will. Some won't. But we will never be silent again. Now, I turn to you. Watching from your home, your bus stop, your break room. Ask yourself, has Africa been quiet too long? Has her truth been borrowed, her name misspoken? If you believe the story matters, let it echo. Say Africa New in the comments below. Like. Comment. Subscribe. Because this isn't just about Burkina Faso. This is about all of us reclaiming the voice they tried to erase. Dawn broke over Ouagadougou like the closing of a prayer. There were no fireworks, no sirens, only silence, the kind that follows a storm or a birth. On that morning, the flags of Burkina Faso fluttered side by side with the red and green of the Sahel Alliance. The American embassy remained sealed shut. The streets were quiet, but under the hush was something deeper: conviction. Not everyone agreed, not everyone celebrated, but none could deny, something irreversible had been set in motion. Captain Ibrahim stood at the window of the presidential palace, eyes fixed on the horizon. His uniform was the same, but something in his gaze had changed. Behind him, ministers spoke in hushed tones. They worried about trade deals, falling aid, upcoming rains. But Traoré was far away, thinking not of dollars or policies, but of memory. He thought of the 2,000 who died last year, of the mothers who buried sons in silence, of the children learning under trees with no books. He remembered what it meant to be invisible, not because the world cannot see you, but because it chooses not to. Captain Ibrahim latest news flashed again on international headlines, this time with a question: has Burkina Faso lost its mind, or found its soul? In Paris, they called him dangerous. In Washington, a senator declared, "This young man will ruin his country." In Brussels, meetings were held, grants suspended, dossiers reviewed. But inside Burkina Faso, the air was different. You could feel it on the buses, in the markets, in the prayers at dawn. It was the air of people who knew hunger, yes, but who now tasted something rarer: ownership of their destiny. In a crowded hospital hallway, a nurse counted medicine bottles with worry. But she turned to the reporter and said, "I'd rather heal with less than kneel with more." In a northern village, elders gathered under a baobab tree. One said, "I've lived through 5 presidents. None ever told the West no until now." In the capital, students painted murals that read, "We write our future." A new generation was awakening. Not with rage, but with resolve. Still, the cost was mounting. The United States moved forward with sanctions. NGOs pulled out. Media narratives grew darker. Burkina Faso latest news, defiance deepens isolation, read one headline. But Traoré had expected it. In a televised address, he stood before the nation, flanked by soldiers and school teachers. They will call us foolish, he said, because we will not crawl. They will say we are doomed, because we choose to stand. The crowd behind him did not cheer. They stood in silence, hands over hearts. This was not about applause. It was about remembering. Burkina Faso was not alone. In Bamako, the president of Mali said, "We stand with dignity." In Niamey, a parade was held with AES flags. In Johannesburg, a speaker at a youth summit declared, "Africa is no longer waiting to be saved." In Harlem, an old man whispered in a barber shop, "This feels like something our ancestors dreamed of." And maybe it was. Maybe the cries of the Middle Passage, the chains of colonization, the hush of post-independence silence, all of it had led to this defiant breath of freedom. Captain Ibrahim walked through a refugee camp that afternoon. A girl, barefoot and smiling, ran up to him. "Will we have school tomorrow?" she asked. He knelt beside her and said, "We will build it. Maybe not today. Maybe not the way they promised. But with our own hands." That image, captured in a single frame, spread across Africa. It wasn't a photo of charity. It was a photo of choice. And now I turn to you, watching, listening, feeling the weight of this story. What would you choose? Bread with chains, or hunger with pride? Silence with comfort, or voice with consequence? This isn't just about Burkina Faso. This is about every people who were told to wait. If you feel the weight of this moment, type Africa Rise in the comments. Like this story. Share it with someone who still believes. Subscribe, because silence won't write our history. But we can. The wind over Ouagadougou carries more than dust now. It carries memory, defiance, and hope. What happened on August 18 was not just a diplomatic rupture. It was a declaration, raw, unpolished, unapologetic. In choosing dignity over dependency, Burkina Faso didn't just close a door, it opened a new chapter. And the world is still watching, still reacting, still trying to define what it means. But maybe for the first time, Africa is writing its own name. Captain Ibrahim latest news is not about policy, it is about spirit. His voice echoed not because it was loud, but because it was clear. He didn't beg for understanding, he demanded recognition. He did not ask for permission, he claimed history. And in doing so, he did what generations before him feared was impossible. He stood tall, with nothing in his hands but everything in his heart. This story is not about politics. It is about a people reclaiming the power to narrate their suffering, their strength, their soul. Burkina Faso latest news isn't only for Africa. It's a mirror held up to every nation that ever bowed too low for too long. The message is simple, and it is ancient: we are not what they say we are. So if Captain Ibrahim latest news stirred something in you, let it rise. If you felt your ancestors' breath in these words, speak them forward. Leave a mark. Say it out loud. Africa knew, because this is a beginning, not an end. We may walk hungry, but we will not walk bowed. We may be isolated, but we are no longer invisible. Let them watch. Let them write. Let them wonder. If this story moved something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like. Share. Speak. Subscribe, because they hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story, the kind they still don't want you to hear.